Alright, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, coming at you with a series of video presentations for the Rankin Technical College AWD Application and Web Development 1111 .NET Framework with Web Databases class. Here is the main textbook that we're scheduled to use for the class, that being ASP.NET MVC with Entity Framework and CSS by Lee Naylor. Before going through that, I've decided to go through several chapters from Professional ASP.NET MVC 5 by John Galloway of Microsoft and others. I've just started on Chapter 8, Ajax. In fact, I'm only a page or so in. And let's talk some jQuery. The jQuery mantra is kind of write less, do more. They claim a tenfold or more savings in code. So in other words, some JavaScript that you write in 100 lines you can typically write in jQuery in about 10 lines. Now, a couple things about this that are really important that you realize. jQuery is JavaScript. jQuery is a JavaScript library. As it says, it's flexible, it's lightweight, it supports all the modern browsers, it hides inconsistencies between browsers, it supports the latest and greatest CSS3 features and functionality. As mentioned, it's one of the most popular JavaScript libraries in existence. Now, I remember this was a while back, seeing where they'd gone through the top 10,000 websites in the world, and they figured out that at a minimum, 75% of them were using jQuery in one form or another. So 10,000 times 0.75, that means 7,500 of those. All right. As it says, we'll see in this chapter, the MVC framework builds on top of jQuery to provide features like client-side validation, asynchronous postbacks, which we'll get to in a bit, etc. So they first want to give you a tour of some of the jQuery features. jQuery allows you to manipulate HTML elements. So the idea is when you create a web page, what gets created for you behind the scenes, however you want to call it, because you never really exactly see it, is something called the DOM, or the Document Object Model. And what jQuery allows you to do, among other things, is to manipulate the DOM. It says here the gateway to using jQuery is the jQuery function. The jQuery function object is the object you use to gain access to jQuery features. All right, the function has a tendency to perplex developers when they first start using jQuery. I will 100% agree with this. All right. In the past, in the AWD1111 course that I have taught, all right, we've used this book, JavaScript 6th edition. Nope, that's not it. Let's see. That's it, Web Warrior series. And it's not a terrible book. It's actually a pretty good book by Don Gosselin and Sasha Vodnik. All right. So why am I even telling you this? Well, there you go. If you go through here, you'll notice there's 11 chapters that are just on JavaScript. Chapter 11 is on Ajax. And then we get to Chapter 12, where we've got an introduction to jQuery. Well, one thing as a teacher, you know, this book is 600 or 700 pages, maybe even more than that. You know, typically you're working like crazy to get through the basic stuff so people have a basic understanding of what's going on. And then what's left in the second half here, you kind of do a pick and choose. So for instance, I gave them about a class period just so they understood what object-oriented functionality was. Yeah, we went over dates and strings. We skipped information and security, which is very important. We skipped touch, etc., but we did go through this. And by and large, I found that the students were really confused. We are changing this semester, and we're actually going to use 2 books from Burach, and this is one of them, although the one that we're going to use for various political reasons isn't the 4th edition, it's the 3rd edition. Thought I could get to it from here. And we're using this one, Burach's JavaScript and jQuery. Now, what I wanted to do first, though, was to show you, well, if we look in here, you'll notice that this book, if I go down and peruse my way to the table of contents, again, we've got 7 chapters just on JavaScript, then 5 chapters where they introduce jQuery, then 6 more chapters where they give you advanced stuff. So the idea is we'll have several chapters that we can go through to talk about jQuery. So the hope is that students will have a better understanding. Now, what does all this stuff mean? This is jQuery right here. So let's look at it. First thing that you see there, the $ function paren. Well, you got a function without a name, meaning that it's an anonymous function. All right, but the $ here is an alias. It means the same thing as writing jQuery right there. What this says is when the browser loads the web page and the DOM has been all set up, what we want to have happen with these lines of code here is what we're saying is we could put this in our ASP.NET, and it says when we take our mouse and we move our mouse over any of our album images, we're going to animate them. We're going to make them get 25 pixels bigger and then 25 pixels smaller. So in other words, they get the idea of animation, bigger, smaller type of an idea. All right, that's my explanation of this. I'm not going to go through all of what the author goes through. And it's not that it's bad, it's very good. But I'm trying not to confuse people. All right. It says here this string, this line of code that you see right here, is a selector that tells jQuery what elements we're searching for in the DOM. So we are searching for all images that are under an ID that's called album-list. So what happens, this will run and it'll animate over all of those. If there are none, there's none to wrap over or to animate over. jQuery exploits the functional programming capabilities of JavaScript. You'll often find yourself creating and passing functions as parameters into jQuery methods. I would strongly suggest that, and we may do this in the classroom, that when we get to this point, that we might go over to w3schools.com. All right, we'll look over here under our tutorials and see if there is a tutorial in here someplace. There you go, learn jQuery. And we might spend, notice we got it here, here, and here, 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 a class period just going over this. They've had jQuery, but by this time it'll been almost a year since they've had it, so we'll do that as a refresher. All right. Selectors here on page 216, as the author says, selectors are the strings you pass to the jQuery function to select DOM elements. So let's look at some ones that you could use. The £, remember, means ID. The period here means class. So this says find an element with an ID of header. Remember, there can only be one ID with that name per page. This says find everything that uses the class that's called editor hyphen label. This says find all div elements. This says find all div elements that are descendants of, all right, that are descendants of an ID of header. That's all descendants. This is all children. You can get into a lot of stuff in here that gets really confusing. This says all anchor tags that are even numbered anchor tags. A lot of times you use even and odd in here for doing things like zebra striping, for example. If you want every other line in a table or whatever to be of a different color. For a full list of the CSS selectors, you can click the link right there. All right. Another one of jQuery's strengths is the API or application program interface it provides for subscribing to events in the DOM. It says there, as demonstrated earlier, you tell jQuery what to do when an event occurs by passing in a function. The function can be anonymous, as we saw earlier, or it can be, like in this case, a named function. Okay? So this is doing virtually the same thing that we did previously, but it's doing it with a name function instead of an anonymous function. What's the advantage of using a named function versus an anonymous function? A named function can be called repeatedly if that needs to be done. Typically, an anonymous function is one that's designed to be called just one time. All right. After you have some DOM elements selected, or you're inside of an event handler, jQuery makes manipulating elements on a page easy. I'm going to change that to a little bit more intuitive. So this line says what? Anchor tags, when we mouse over them, what we want is the current anchor tag that we're mousing over to add a class of highlight. What does that mean? Well, it's whatever highlight is. We could maybe tell it to be yellow in color, for example. So when you mouse over it, it gets that. Then when you mouse out, it goes away. It says a couple of interesting notes about this code. All the jQuery methods you use against a wrap set like mouse over return the same thing. So you can do a bunch of stuff to it. You can say this dot add class dot something else, and that's called chaining. Secondly, there's almost always more than one way. In fact, I would virtually say there's always more than one way of doing the same thing in here. It's just the way that it works. It says we could have rewritten that last snippet of code that you see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines, which is 3 lines. Toggle class means when you hover over it, if it wasn't highlighted, you highlight it now, and if it was highlighted, you'll unhighlight it. jQuery includes everything you need to send asynchronous requests back to your server. We've done this before, but let's go back and type in asynchronous versus synchronous. Oh, what do you mean by this? Let's see. Synchronous means working together at the same time. Oh, let's see. I don't like the way that reads. Wikipedia. Boy, I don't like these at all. Well, this is the way that I look at it. Okay? When something is being done synchronously, That's, for example, the way human conversation is supposed to work. All right, what does that mean? All right, that means that I'm sitting there talking to my friend Doug, and I've got something to tell him. So I start talking, and Doug listens appropriately. When I get done talking, and he knows that I'm done, then he begins talking. So in other words, we're not talking at the same time. Something happens, it ends, then something else can happen. All right? On the other hand, with asynchronous, I can start talking, Doug can sit there and he can be off in his own little world, let's say, and I say something and it kind of clicks with him, so he starts talking immediately. And we're both talking at the same time. Well, the way that works in programming languages is typically when something is done synchronously, all right, it has to run from beginning to end and nothing else can happen while that's running. If something is done asynchronously, typically what that means is it can be put in the background and other things can end up running. Now, that's my take on it. You may or may not agree with everything I just said or think that what I said was correct or whatever, and that's fine. All right, the next topic that's in here starts on page 218, and it is on unobtrusive JavaScript. So I'll be back with that in just a couple minutes.